Oi, it's been a tough year and a half, as Will so aptly put it. So much suffering, so much brokenness, and we are still here. Nothing is over, but shehachianu. We have been kept alive and sustained and have, thank God, reached this moment. Some of us have uncovered new strengths or new patience in this terrible time. Some of us have found new passions. Yes, bread baking and crafts, but also walking in the park, caring for neighbors. Some of us have come to appreciate the small things. Who knew that just getting together with friends would feel like such a miracle? But we know that not everyone who has survived is thriving. Many of us are struggling. I've often wondered, what is it that allows some people who experience trauma to blossom while others are brought to their knees? When I worked in elder care, I saw people who were simply remarkable. 89-year-old Eva attended Shabbat services in the nursing home each week. No big deal. But Eva did it in a wheelchair, attached to a feeding tube that had to be plugged in during the service. One day after services, I found Eva very carefully and slowly wrapping a small square in tinfoil. I was curious about it. Oh, this, Eva said, this is a square of chocolate. I have to take medicine that has a very bitter taste. After I take it, I'm so happy that I can take a tiny bit of chocolate, and that makes me feel better. Eva was buoyed by the tiniest bit of sweetness amid the bitterness of her pain and illness. Hannah, on the other hand, was filled with acrimony. She complained about her son. She complained about the staff. She complained about being in the home. Hannah weighed all of 70 pounds and did not appear to eat, though she did hoard challah rolls and cereal boxes in her room. A Holocaust survivor, Hannah seemed to be fueled and kept alive by rage. Her existence was painful for her and for everyone around her. The Talmudic rabbis say, when trying to understand distinctions, "My beinayho," what is between them? What makes for the difference between them? How can we understand the mystery of resilience? How can we get some? I want to draw on a teaching of the Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical tradition, in order to frame our quest for resilience amid suffering. Here's what we learned from Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great mystical sage of 16th century Israel. Rabbi Luria teaches, the world we live in, the very life we have, is born out of shattering, shever. According to Luria, God wanted to share the divine love by creating a world. But God found that it was impossible because God filled the entire universe. There was no room for a world. So God contracted God's self and created vessels of matter to be the world. Sadly, things did not turn out as God planned. You've heard the expression, man plans and God laughs. Well, in this case, God planned and God was not laughing. God's light could not be contained by the vessels that God had created to be the world. The vessels shattered. The light that was abundant and everywhere before creation became hidden and dispersed. The light was encased in shards of the vessels that had been intended to hold it. And this, teaches Rabbi Luria, is the state of reality ever since. The divine is now limited and concealed in a world of darkness. Our human task is to find and to liberate those sparks, and thus bring repair or tikkun and redemption to this broken existence. Every time we come upon a spark of light in the darkness, we experience a new beginning, a birth out of brokenness. Every time we find the capacity to start again, we live the verse, Chadesh Yameinu, renew our days. We don't go back, but we experience newness, freshness, and possibility once again. All of us know shever or shatterings very well, especially in this time of pandemic, in this liminal state in which we find ourselves. We are living through the shattering of disillusionment. We are experiencing disillusionment that science has somehow become political. And a huge swath of our country willfully denies what is abundantly clear. The coronavirus pandemic is lethal. The vaccines work with layered protection, masks and social distancing and vaccines. No one need get sick. How could it be that resisting life-saving measures would be seen as an issue of personal freedom? We are distraught that our country is riven by division and mistrust, that we cannot even come together to bring the suffering from the pandemic to an end. And we face disillusionment that rights we and our forebears fought for and thought were assured have been ripped away. After decades in which the hard-fought right to vote was protected by law and court order, now more and more barriers have been constructed to stop Black people and other voters of color from exercising their right to direct the course of our city, state, and country. After court, including the Supreme Court, affirmed a woman's right to choose, now the Supreme Court has upheld an effective ban on all abortions in Texas. How could this be? And we are crushed that anti-Semitism has been unleashed in a deadly way in our country and around the world. In addition to the shattering of disillusionment, we're living through the shattering of loss. As Will said so beautifully, we have all experienced the dashing of plans and expectations in the face of lockdown and quarantine. Some of us have faced the loss of jobs and livelihood. All too many of us have endured the tragic loss of dear ones felled too soon by COVID-19. Often these losses hit us without our being able to mourn them as we ordinarily would have done. We had funerals attended by no one, Zoom shivas that allowed people from all over to come, but robbed us of the opportunity to share bagels, hugs, and stories. And way too many of us are living through the shattering of isolation. Those of us who live alone or who are distant from family or who have no family may have felt alone like never before. So how do we begin again? How do we find rebirth after or even in the midst of all of this brokenness? What we want to find is resilience. Resilience is defined by psychologists as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. I want to share two stories of resilience from my family. My father-in-law, whom I never met, was named Avram, the same name our son has. Avram was 20 years old when he escaped Khmelnyk, his Polish hometown, after all of the Jews were rounded up and killed, including his parents and 6 sisters. Avram spent 2 years in a hole beneath a stable owned by a Gentile neighbor. In the hole, Avram would go over all the Torah and Talmud he had learned in his childhood yeshiva, asking himself questions, solving complex halachic puzzles. And Avram would visualize the windows on every house and building in Chmelnik. He would count them over and over. In that dark place where Avram and the man with whom he was hiding could not stand up, where their clothes disintegrated, where there were repeated terribly close calls, Nazis in the barn above their heads. In that dark place, Avram found the light of Torah and the light of memory. My mother-in-law, Miriam, lived in Warsaw with her parents and 6 sisters. Miriam lost her father, who was too weak to move to a bunker when the Nazis were rounding Jews up. And she lost a sister who took poison when she lost hope that she would get out alive. Miriam lived through the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the Nazi liquidation and bombing of the ghetto. Her mother and another sister were ripped from her side on arrival at the Majdanek concentration camp. Miriam survived the war with 2 sisters, Blanca and Alice. Time and again, the 3 saved one another. When Alice was sick with typhus and so weak she couldn't stand, Miriam propped her up to protect her from getting sent to the gas chamber. When Blanca, a nurse, was able to get a job in the infirmary, she got her sisters work by lying and saying that they were also nurses. When they were marched for days on end in the death march at the end of the war, starving and emaciated from years in concentration camp, the 3 sisters practically carried one another when they couldn't walk one more step. Miriam, Blanca, and Alice survived all that because they had luck, but also because they had love. Avram and Miriam met after the war in Poland. They fell in love instantly and came to America with Blanca, Alice, and 2 other cousins. They grieved every day for the 128 immediate relatives they had lost in the Shoah. And they built a rich life and a big extended family, forever sustained by their courage and resilience. Literally, from the ashes, they began again. How do we foster resilience? John Leland is a New York Times reporter who's been following centenarians, people over 100 years old, throughout the pandemic, and including throughout the pandemic. And he's interested in this question. Leland says resilience is a collection of concrete habits we can work toward, not what you have, but what you do. So we're going to talk about 2 collections of concrete habits. First, resilient people draw on their past experience. Leland noticed that centenarians who had survived the Holocaust or other traumas often were coping better during the pandemic than those who had had more ordinary lives. Leland described this phenomenon with the term crisis competence. We develop the ability to get through difficulty and suffering by getting through difficulty and suffering. We tell a story of our lives that highlights the fact that we have overcome. Leland writes, as we get older, we get the sense that we're going to be able to handle it because we've been able to handle challenges in the past. You know you get past it. These things happen, but there's an end to it, and there's a life after that. Not only can we draw on our own personal experience, but we can rely on Jewish history as a source of resilience. Rabbi Erin League Smuckler, an Orthodox woman, by the way, recently edited a book that could not be more timely. It is called Torah in a Time of Plague. Rabbi Smuckler says, Jewish history is anchored in collective loss, and it is characterized by collective resilience. So there are resources that we might draw upon to find our grounding once again. According to the Talmud, after the destruction of the Second Temple, large numbers of Jews became ascetics, depriving themselves of meat, wine, and all pleasure. They said, how can we enjoy life when so much has been lost? The sage Rabbi Joshua answered, my children, listen to me. Not to mourn at all is impossible because the blow has fallen. To mourn too much is also impossible because we do not impose upon the community a hardship which the majority cannot endure. Thereafter, the sages required that when building a house, you had to leave a little piece bare. When getting married, the groom would put ashes on his forehead to remember Jerusalem. And when wearing jewelry, one was required to refrain from wearing all of one's jewelry. One had to leave a little bit off. After trauma, the rabbis guide us not to give up, but, as Rabbi Smuckler puts it, to step back into life in ways that contain loss while also retaining it. One can keep brokenness and all its hard-won truths at the forefront of one's consciousness without being broken by it. Rabbi Smuckler writes, when our worlds fall apart, our instincts might be to withdraw, but this tradition asks us to find a way to accommodate a new reality. And Judaism has done just that time and again. When Jerusalem was under siege by the Roman army in the year 70, it looked very much like all would be lost. The temple would be destroyed, Jewish self-rule would cease, and Judaism would be no more. Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of the greatest sages in Jerusalem, saw that there was no future. He had himself smuggled out of the city in a coffin to the city of Yavne. He negotiated with the Roman general, Vespasian. He said, give me Yavne and its sages. Yochanan ben Zakkai was thus able to establish an academy that studied and ruled about how Judaism was to be practiced now that the old way was impossible. They ruled that the home and the synagogue would be the Jewish sacred center now that the temple was lost. That animal sacrifices would be replaced by prayer and study, and that acts of kindness would be our means of serving the divine. Yochanan ben Zakkai and his colleagues effected an outrageous thing. They completely reinvented our tradition. They began again when it seemed clear that they and the Torah and the Jewish people had reached the end of the road. We owe them our Judaism. The Jewish people have engaged in reinvention repeatedly as we've been dislocated, persecuted, depleted. In the wake of the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, even after the Holocaust, when we very nearly were wiped from the face of the earth, we have had to chadesh yameinu, renew and reinvent, and we have done that. In the context of continued threat of illness due to COVID-19, we have reinvented Jewish life here at CBH. As Will said, we moved from worshiping here in our sanctuary or at St. Bart's to praying on Zoom. We couldn't sing together or hug one another, but we have felt connected nonetheless. More of us than ever have joined in Kabbalat Shabbat services week in, week out. Our members and leaders have invented new religious forms, a 15-minute evening minyan, and our mindful moments that have been a comfort and an inspiration for so many of us. Our chorus recorded a hauntingly beautiful album, Red Thread, from their closets in lockdown. Now the chorus is doing what we thought was impossible, singing together right here on Zoom, through the wizardry of Jamulus technology and the brilliant leadership of Will and Bayan. And CBH will keep reinventing whatever the virus throws at us. We will find new ways to gather. In particular, we'll be creating small groups with which to celebrate Shabbat and foster community. whether in person, inside or outside, or on Zoom. Watch out for Shabbat Chevras coming soon to a shul near you. So looking back at our past and our people's history is a source of resilience. Another source of resilience is our spiritual life. As we chant the Unatana Tokef prayer, we are overwhelmed at how much is beyond us. We don't know and we can't control who shall live and who shall die, who by plague and who by fire, who by water. If these words ever felt abstract, they certainly don't now. We could say, who by hurricane, who by wildfire, who by pandemic, who at a ripe old age, who by hunger, who by police violence. Yet the prayer ends, uteshuva, utefila, utsedaka, but repentance, prayer, and just action or tzedakah, ma'avirin et roa hagezerah, avert the evil of the decree. In everyday language, we do not know what will befall us, and we certainly can't prevent it. But there are things we can do that will sweeten the bitterness, that will help us not only to keep going in the face of suffering and trauma, but to begin again. One of the three elements of spiritual life that can foster resilience is teshuvah, turning and repentance. We can let go of past hurts and errors. We can apologize. We can work to forgive even ourselves. That's what we're here to do throughout this season of renewal. The chutzpahdik, audacious claim of Yom Kippur is that we can begin anew. We can start fresh. Yom Kippur is a birth out of brokenness. The second thing the prayer tells us we can do to build our resilience is tefillah, our prayer. We can reach out to God, the divine, the source, to holiness. We are taught that the Shekhinah, the feminine indwelling presence of God, wept with us when the temple was destroyed and went into exile with us. We believe in the words of the Psalms, Imo anochi b'tzara, God is with us in suffering. We have customs in our tradition awaiting reclamation, such as reciting Psalms in moments of illness or danger. The 150 Psalms we have express every conceivable human emotion. It can be so comforting to read or chant them, to find our experience reflected, whether despair, loneliness, anger, or hope. We can bring gratitude or hakarat hatov into our prayer life. John Leland noticed that resilient elders are able to savor what they're doing right now instead of brooding about what they've lost. There's no doubt that taking time to notice what's beautiful, what's funny, what's enlivening, what's not wrong changes us. Gratitude actually gives us enhanced physical and emotional well-being. Gratitude is a muscle. We need to exercise it. That's why the first prayer we traditionally say upon rising in the morning is Modeh Ani or Moda Ani. I give thanks that you have lovingly restored my spirit, that I have awakened, that I can start anew. This is why we will continue as a congregation to engage in gratitude practice at services on Shabbat when we come to Psalm 92. Tov lehodot l'Adonai, it's good to give thanks to God, because it is. I hope that we'll go even deeper into our prayer lives in the year ahead, experimenting with ways to connect to the spark within and between us, maybe even daring to share our spiritual experiences with one another. The third thing we can do to foster resiliency in the face of raw circumstances, according to the Unatana Tokef, is tzedakah, just action, or simply helping others. John Leland found that reaching out to someone more isolated or needy helped the elders he followed to be resilient. He says that those who believe they have something valuable to give are more able to deal with what life throws at them. He gives the example of a man who could no longer go daily to the senior center during lockdown, and so began calling a Holocaust survivor friend daily just to check in. This may have helped the survivor, but it certainly sustained the caller. Psychologist Dan Gottlieb was rendered a paraplegic in a terrible car accident 35 years ago. Dr. Dan says that he wanted to kill himself during his weeks in the hospital. He felt that he could no longer be himself. And then late one night, a nurse came into the room. "You're a therapist, right?" she said. "I used to be," Dr. Dan replied. The nurse told Dr. Dan that she was so depressed she was contemplating suicide. He talked to her for hours and referred her to competent help. After that moment, Dr. Dan no longer wanted to die. He realized that his hurt enabled him to have even greater compassion than he had before. He went on to have a profound career as a therapist, author, and host of a call-in show on public radio that helped countless people. There's so much need for tzedakah, just and caring action, for people in our CBH community and in the wider world. Soon we will support our CBH Chaverim with the revival of the CBH care team. We hope that members will step forward to offer rides, meals, and to do whatever they can to ease the way for our Chaverim experiencing illness, loss, or challenge. Beyond our community, the needs are endless. We are bound only by our imagination and our time. In coming weeks, we'll be organizing to do what we can to help the 150 Afghani refugee families that will soon arrive in Atlanta. We will continue working to fight voter suppression and to engage in other forms of care and activism as the needs become known and members of our community step up. Please let me or Greg Lawrence know if you're interested in supporting our members through the CBH care team or in organizing to welcome our new Afghani neighbors. So much shattering. Where is the repair, the tikkun? This is the tikkun, seeking out the light instead of dwelling in the darkness. This is the birth out of brokenness. This is the renewal of our days. Source of light, source of life, source of love. In this challenging new year, may we find the spark of our resilience. May we turn to our past, toward our tradition, and toward one another to find the hidden light. As we grow in the face of brokenness, may we unite the sparks we uncover and allow an ever brighter light to shine for us and all the world. Ken Yehi Ratzon, so may it be God's will.